if you zoom in on a historical map, the borders usually look like these solid, confident lines, right?
Yeah, they imply a sort of permanence.
Exactly, imply permanence. But if you look closer at the highlands between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, you'll find this really terrifying recurring anomaly.
Right.
Entire populations just vanishing into thin air. And, not from the slow drift of time, not from like the unintended chaotic casualties of war or a plague, but by meticulous bureaucratic design.
It is a deliberate erasure. And while this is a very heavy history, so I think we need to acknowledge the gravity of this right up front for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are examining imperial expulsions that escalated into total annihilation. So this is a deep dive into the actual mechanics of mass forcible removal and genocide. We aren't just looking at the tragedy, we are looking at the machinery behind it.
Right. To do this, we are pulling from a very specific stack of sources for you today. We've got historical records, international court rulings, telegraphs, and demographic studies from some of the leading scholars in the field.
People like Walter Richmond, Raymond Kevorkian.
Yeah, and Taner Aksam, Ronald Gregorsuni. Our mission here is to understand how these removals actually function on the ground and how the bureaucratic toolkit of displacement evolved over about 160 years.
And to guide our analysis through that timeline, we are going to apply what we'll call a series test to 3 distinct historical events in this region.
Okay, what does that test look like?
For each removal, we will examine 4 specific criteria: consent, necessity, proportionality, and above all, the right of return. When you run the historical record through this specific analytic framework, the patterns just become impossible to ignore.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start in 1864 with the end of the Russo-Circassian War. And context is everything here.
It really is.
This wasn't just some brief border skirmish. This was a brutal, century-long colonial conflict in the Caucasus. By the early 1860s, the Russian Empire had essentially won.
Right, they had military control.
Yeah, but rather than simply absorbing and governing the indigenous Circassians, they made a decision that set a really chilling modern precedent.
They did. Russian General Nikolai Yevdokimov designed a plan, and this was explicitly approved all the way up the chain of command to Tsar Alexander II.
Wow.
The plan was not to rule the indigenous population of the Northwest Caucasus. The plan was to remove them entirely. They wanted to clear the Western Caucasus to make room for Cossack colonization.
Which, that raises the immediate question of how. How does a 19th century empire physically uproot an entire indigenous society?
It's a massive undertaking.
The logistics of that are just staggering. It requires a massive application of force, obviously, but also a really calculated strategy of deprivation.
Yeah, the mechanism of expulsion was brutally pragmatic. The Russian army systematically destroyed Circassian crops and livestock just ahead of winter.
Just ahead of winter.
Right. This wasn't just spite, it was a logistical choice. They weaponized starvation to force movement. So they drove entire mountain communities down to these open Black Sea beaches.
Places we know today as Tuapse, Sochi, and Anapa.
Exactly. And then the populations were just left there on the shore, starving, ridden with typhus and smallpox, just waiting for overcrowded, unsafe boats to take them across the Black Sea to Ottoman ports like Trabzon.
And this is where the mechanics of the event really define its nature. Think about it. If a modern government destroys a society's food supply, forces hundreds of thousands of people onto a barren winter beach with zero infrastructure.
Nothing.
Right, and leaves them exposed to disease while waiting for totally inadequate transport, the resulting death toll isn't a tragic accident.
No, it's not.
It's a mathematical certainty that is baked into the logistics of the operation.
That is exactly what the historical record reflects. You can read the intent in those logistics. Ottoman quarantine officials at the reception ports recorded the dying continuing by the hundreds every single day upon arrival.
Oh my God.
The people were physically broken before they even boarded the ships.
So we need to talk about the numbers here. And also, I want to be very clear with you, the listener, about why these numbers are contested.
Yes. The historical records are inherently fragmented for a few key reasons. Tsarist Russia never conducted a baseline census of the independent Caucasus before the war.
So we don't even have a firm starting population.
Exactly. And the embarkation counts on those beaches were chaotic, to say the least. Plus, the Ottoman reception records are incomplete.
Right.
Furthermore, Russian military tallies at the time had a vested political interest in undercounting the human costs.
Sure. But despite that fog, scholars have worked rigorously to reconstruct the scale of this. And the consensus is just staggering.
It is. The scholarly range for those expelled in just that 1863 to 1864 period runs from roughly 800,000 to 1.5 million people.
Wow.
That represents over 90% of the entire Circassian population. Scholar Walter Richmond estimates that at least 600,000 Circassians died.
600,000.
Yes, from massacres, from the engineered starvation, from epidemics on the beaches, and from drowning during those Black Sea crossings.
Over 90% of a population permanently removed. When we apply our series test to 1864, the framework is incredibly clarifying. Consent, 0.
None.
Necessity. I mean, the pretext was securing a conquered frontier, but the means went vastly beyond any military necessity. Proportionality. It was the disproportionate total removal of a society.
Right.
And return.
Yeah.
0 right of return. Russian law never permitted those refugees or their descendants to go back.
And yet, this is heavily denied today. Official Russia frames 1864 merely as a wartime emigration, like a voluntary relocation. They outright reject the genocide label.
Right.
In fact, as of today, only the nation of Georgia, back in 2011, has formally recognized the Circassian expulsion as genocide, which leaves us with an entire nation transformed into a diaspora.
Largely living in Turkey, Jordan, Syria, and Israel today, while their homeland was renamed and resettled. So you have upwards of 1 million traumatized, starving survivors. The people known as the Muhajirs landing on Ottoman shores. A population that size doesn't just disappear into the background. How did the Ottoman state physically absorb that kind of sudden demographic shock without completely collapsing?
That is the vital bridge in this history. The Ottoman Empire was completely overwhelmed. To manage this crisis, the state had to invent a new kind of bureaucracy.
Okay.
In 1860, they created the Refugee Commission. Historians widely identify this as arguably history's first mass refugee resettlement bureaucracy.
I really want to focus on how this actually functioned because, they didn't have computers.
No, not at all.
They had paper ledgers. They had to build an administrative machine to track demographics, calculate quotas, and allocate land for hundreds of thousands of people.
Exactly, and they didn't just place these muhajirs in temporary holding camps. They strategically deployed them. The Refugee Commission used paper-based quotas to settle these refugees on the frontiers of the empire to secure borders.
So they were using them almost as a buffer.
Yes, they founded modern Amman in Jordan in 1878, for instance. But crucially, the empire also settled them heavily among Christian populations in eastern Anatolia.
Which immediately sparked intense friction. Because, you were taking destitute, armed, traumatized refugees and placing them directly onto lands worked by Armenian and other Christian peasants. You were essentially engineering a localized conflict.
Yes, and scholars like Kemal Karpat, Fuat Dündar, Usur Ümit Ünger, Ryan Gingeris, and Vladimir Hamed Sharansky have studied this specific administrative period intensely.
What's their takeaway?
Their consensus is that this half-century of managing refugees built a profound bureaucratic capacity. The Ottoman state learned how to use demography as a tool. They built the institutional habits, the census techniques, and the mindset for demographic engineering.
Okay, here is where I want to push back and make sure we are being incredibly precise, because we cannot draw a false straight line here.
Right, that's important.
We aren't saying the Circassian refugees caused what happened next. The victims of one tragedy don't automatically trigger another.
That distinction is absolutely vital. No, the refugees did not cause the next catastrophe, nor were the Muhajirs as a people the primary perpetrators.
Okay.
The horrific decisions that followed half a century later belonged entirely to a completely different government, the future Ottoman leadership, the Committee of Union and Progress, or the CUP.
So it's not the people, it's the infrastructure. It makes me think of, like, a city building a massive public transit system to solve a commuter crisis, right?
Right.
The infrastructure itself is neutral. But 50 years later, a completely different government takes power, reverses the tracks, and uses that exact same logistical system to funnel a targeted group of people into a central furnace. The machinery was repurposed.
That is exactly the dynamic. An empire that had learned how to move populations on a massive scale by spreadsheets and quotas found that those same tools could be turned to a much darker use.
Wow.
Victims of the first expulsion literally became the alibi of the next. In the years that followed, Muhajir families would be resettled into homes that had just been violently emptied of their previous owners.
Which means the bureaucracy of resettlement directly fed into the bureaucracy of eradication. And that brings us to the center of this history, 1915, the Armenian genocide.
The event begins officially on April 24th, 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested some 250 Armenian intellectuals, politicians, and community leaders in Constantinople.
So it was a calculated decapitation of the community's leadership.
Exactly. But the central mechanism of the genocide followed a month later, on May 27, with the Tehcir law, which was the temporary law of deportation.
Implemented by the CUP, led by Interior Minister Talat Pasha. And this is the core fact we need you to understand about this history. The deportation wasn't a byproduct of the violence. The deportation itself was the killing weapon.
That is the essential truth of 1915. You have to look at the mechanics of the march. This wasn't a case of people being moved from point A to point B and unfortunately dying along the way. The able-bodied Armenian men were typically separated early on and executed, often after being worked to exhaustion in labor battalions. Then, the women, the children, and the elderly were death-marched south and east toward Deir ez-Zor in the Syrian desert.
They were marched through the mountains without food, without water, and the convoys were routinely massacred by gendarmes, by special organization paramilitary units, and by Kurdish irregulars.
It was relentless.
But even for those who survived the march, you have to look at the destination.
Exactly. If you look at Deir ez-Zor, the intent becomes undeniable. They were marched into a barren desert. There were no houses waiting for them. There was no food allocation. There was absolutely no provision for life at the destination. The desert was chosen specifically because the harsh environment would finish what the marching columns began. You don't need gas chambers if you have a desert and no water.
And we also have to look at the abandoned properties laws. Because this wasn't just murder. It was an enormous wealth transfer.
Oh, absolutely.
The state created a legal framework to immediately absorb the homes, the land, and the bank accounts of the people they were marching into the desert. Bureaucratic liquidations and auctions essentially funded the state while erasing the Armenians' footprint entirely.
The sheer scale of it is staggering. We are looking at a death toll range of 600,000 to 1.5 million dead.
And just to clarify that range for you, most historical scholarship converges near 1 to 1.2 million dead out of an estimated baseline population of 1.5 to 2 million Ottoman Armenians, right?
Yes. The variance in the range is largely driven by rival baseline census counts. The official Ottoman census often undercounted minority populations for tax and conscription reasons, while the Armenian Patriarchate's figures were higher.
But the reality on the ground was observed in real time. The U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, sent cables back to Washington in July 1915, describing it explicitly as a campaign of race extermination.
It was the end of a 3,000-year-old civilization in Anatolia. The churches, the schools, the thousands of villages, they weren't just displaced, they were physically eradicated from the landscape.
Now, we need to address modern Turkey's official denial of this genocide. Understanding the anatomy of state denial is crucial here.
It's a huge part of the story.
Right. If I'm looking at the Turkish official line, it relies on a few key pillars. First, they claim the deportations were simply a wartime relocation necessitated by military security, pointing to a localized Armenian revolt in the city of Van.
Yes, that's the primary argument.
And honestly, if you're a casual reader, that sounds like a plausible military justification. They revolted, so we secured the area. But when you look at the map, that logic completely falls apart, doesn't it?
It collapses under geographical scrutiny. A localized revolt in one city on the eastern frontier does not explain or justify the simultaneous systematic deportation of Armenian populations from provinces hundreds of miles away from any front line. Furthermore, the historical record shows that you don't relocate people for their safety to a barren desert without food or shelter. The destination itself proves the intent was not security, but destruction.
The other major pillar of the denial is the shared suffering argument. They argue that the deaths were the result of wartime chaos, famine, and disease, which caused immense suffering among Muslims as well. And I can see why that's effective for muddying the waters.
Sure.
War is hell, everyone's starved. But there's a massive structural difference, right?
There is an absolute asymmetry. It is entirely true that Muslims suffered horribly during World War I from famine and disease, but the difference is state intent.
Right.
No Muslim population was legally ordered by its own government to be completely uprooted from its ancestral homeland, expropriated of all its wealth, and marched into a desert. The Armenians were targeted by a specific legal and bureaucratic mechanism of the state.
They also argue there was no intent to exterminate, and they point out that the Ottoman state actually prosecuted some soldiers for excesses, which feels like the ultimate contradiction.
It is perhaps the most self-refuting point of the denial. Post-war Ottoman courts-martial actually took place in 1919 and 1920.
Wait, really? The Ottoman state held trials.
Yes. Those very courts convicted Talat Pasha and other CUP leaders in absentia of organizing premeditated massacres. The Ottoman state itself recognized the crime. It was the later Republican government of Turkey that annulled those verdicts and eventually reburied Talat Pasha with honors.
Wow. The legacy of this specific crime is profound. When Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide in 1944, he explicitly had the annihilation of the Armenians in mind alongside the Holocaust.
Yes, it was foundational to his thinking.
When we apply our series test in 1915, consent was non-existent. Necessity was a fabricated pretext. Proportionality was total removal and the liquidation of assets. And return, absolutely zero.
Over time, the legal framework of the world evolved. We got the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, international tribunals, which makes our final segment so disturbing. Because the international law changed, but the mechanism of erasing a population proved terribly persistent.
We are returning to the very same highlands, between the same two worlds, but stepping out of history and into current events. The crisis of 2023 in Nagorno-Karabakh, known to Armenians as Artsakh.
Right. This was an Armenian-populated highland enclave situated inside Soviet-drawn Azerbaijani borders. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, it survived a brutal war in the 1990s, and it survived another war in 2020.
But the mechanism used in 2023 was different. It started with deprivation.
Starting in December 2022, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev imposed a blockade on the Lachin Corridor.
And this is crucial. The Lachin Corridor was the only road connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to the Republic of Armenia.
Exactly. For nearly 10 months, Azerbaijan starved the enclave. They cut off food, fuel, and vital medical supplies to a population of 120,000 people.
The psychological and physical toll of a 10-month starvation siege is unimaginable, and they contained this siege despite a binding order from the International Court of Justice demanding they open the road.
They ignored the court. And then, following that 10-month siege, on September 19th and 20th, 2023, Azerbaijan launched a one-day military offensive that easily broke the starved enclave's defenses.
The resulting exodus was breathtaking in its speed. Over 100,000 of the roughly 120,000 Karabakh Armenians fled down that single mountain road into Armenia.
Just a massive displacement.
In under 2 weeks, an entire society packed whatever they could fit in their cars and left. Now, Azerbaijan called this a voluntary departure. They even published an online reintegration portal for the Armenian residents. And, if you are watching this on the news in 2023, you might see people driving their own cars and think, well, they are leaving voluntarily. How does international law look at that?
International tribunals have a very specific standard for this called the Coercive Environment Standard. Legal precedent states that an exodus driven by a prolonged blockade, severe deprivation of basic necessities, and a sudden military assault constitutes forcible displacement.
So it doesn't matter how they leave.
It absolutely does not matter if the people are driving their own cars. If the environment has been made deliberately unsurvivable, their departure is forced.
Which brings us to the legal fallout and the current reality. In November 2023, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, issued a binding order demanding that Azerbaijan allow the safe, unimpeded, and expeditious return of those who fled.
But as we look at the situation by mid-2026, essentially 0 Armenians have returned. A tiny remnant population remains, reported in the dozens, mostly the elderly. The capital city of Stepanakert has been renamed to Kankendi. The physical erasure is nearly complete.
And the diplomatic reality is even starker. In August 2025, a peace text was initialed at the White House by Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. But it remains unsigned because Baku is demanding changes to the Armenian constitution.
And if you read the specifics of that draft text, it contains absolutely no mechanism for the right of return for the Karabakh Armenians. Furthermore, it requires Armenia to withdraw its international court claims, including the ICJ case.
Let's apply our series test to 2023. Consent? None and exodus under the threat of a coercive environment is not consent. Necessity. A 10-month blockade of civilian food and medicine is not a standard military necessity.
No, it's not.
Proportionality. The total removal of a 120,000-person society in 2 weeks. And return.
This is the most damning part of the test for the modern era. The right of return was legally ordered by the world's highest court, but it has been entirely ignored on the ground and is currently being negotiated away in a political peace treaty.
When you synthesize all of this, looking back over the 160-year timeline, the sheer scale of the erasure is haunting. We have seen 3 distinct borderland removals,
The empires change, the technology changes from woody boats to death marches to modern cars, but the playbook remains incredibly consistent.
Yeah.
In 1864, they were driven onto the beaches of the Black Sea. In 1915, they were death marched into the deserts of Syria. In 2023, they were starved out and driven down a blockaded mountain road.
And in all three cases, despite changing eras and evolving global norms, no one was allowed to go home. The fundamental mechanism of removing a population and taking their land remains terribly effective.
It does.
It leaves you with a really chilling question to consider. If international courts can legally mandate a people's right to return to their homeland, but a subsequent political peace treaty can retroactively erase that right and force the dropping of the court cases. Wait, let me rephrase that.
Yeah, go ahead.
If that can happen, does international law actually protect vulnerable populations?
Oh.
Or does it merely serve to properly document their disappearance?
It is a question that challenges the entire foundation of our modern international order.
Like and subscribe, it really helps the channel reach others.